Welcome, my dear students. I am going to talk about strong and weak verbs in Middle English. I hope and expect that by the end of this session, you would understand what was the difference in strong and weak verbs and their treatment in the Middle English period and how it was different from Old English. Well, what happened apart from some leveling of inflections and the weakening of endings in accordance with the general tendency? We need to notice how was the process. Okay, as a matter of fact, the principal changes in the verb during this were the serious losses suffered by the strong conjugation. This conjugation, although including some of the most important verbs in the language, was relatively small as compared with large and steadily growing body of weak verbs. So, during the period of shift from Old English to the Modern English, as the language was developing, the number of these weak forms increased. Coming towards the point how verbs were formed during this period, I would say an occasional verb developed a strong past tense or past participle by analogy with similar strong verbs. So, on the same pattern, as we do now, move, moved, work, worked. So, using the same formula, the same analogy, the verbs would be made. Now, there were certain weak verbs as well. New verbs formed from nouns and adjectives or borrowed from other languages were regularly conjugated as weak. And when we talk of the losses among the strong verbs, nearly a third of the strong verbs in Old English died out early in the Middle English period. In fact, 90 of them have left no traces in written records after 1150. Well, some of them may have been current for a time in the spoken language, but except for occasional verb that survived in the modern dialect, we do not find any records of these verbs. In fact, its use was not very much governed by any strong sense. There was not any particular formula that would be applied. Notice on the screen there are 3 examples for you. Notice this one, the verb sing, the verb drive, and the verb fall. Now, how are the other forms made? For sing, we have sang and sung. But in comparison to this, for drive, we have drove and driven, which is very much different from the formula that is applied to sing, sang, and sung. Compare these two with the third example that is given, fall. Fall, fell, fallen. Yet another formula applied. So, there was not a particular or a singular formula that would be applied. Why it was so? Why it was not regularized? Why it was not standardized? Okay, the simple answer is circumstances led to it. However, going into the depth of that, we need to think about what were those circumstances that led towards that. There were certain sociocultural reasons that were happening in the background. Middle English language, at that time point was chiefly the language of the lower class. So, these were the people who were using this language as, masses. They were mostly illiterate people. They were mostly the people who were not highly educated. Now, because they were not highly educated, because largely removed from the restraining influences of education, they were living a life that had as such no formalized learning of language. The natural result was that the language, that is Middle English language, it was taking shape and form that they were giving to it, which of course was not very much refined in certain ways. Also because these masses were away from what we call, the literary tradition. as they were away from the literary tradition, they did not know the literary standards. So, the language would be used as people would like to use it without caring much for, standardization or following any formulas. So, my dear students, in these circumstances, in this context or in this backdrop, it was very natural that many speakers should apply the pattern of weak verbs to some which were historically very strong.